Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, sponsored by the National Health Association. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and today I'm absolutely delighted to have as my guest Adam Sud. Adam is the founder and CEO of Plant-Based for Positive Change. He has certifications in nutrition from the Center for Nutritional Studies, the T. Colin Campbell program up at Cornell. He's also got a holistic lifestyle certification through the Czech Institute, and his work as an inspirational speaker and lecturer has been through many summits and things. And I love the fact that your work is really trying to really manifest the importance of plant-based nutrition for mental health and addiction. And I really want to go deeply into that with you. So welcome, Adam. I'm so happy you're here. Thank you. Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association, the oldest organization in the world, championing the extraordinary benefits of a whole plant food diet and healthy lifestyle, as well as water-only fasting. We believe that health results from healthful living and focus on evidence-based science that promotes the health of you and your loved ones, as well as the health of all animals and the environment. We feature experts from a cross-section of disciplines within the plant nutrition, vegan, psychological, environmental, and animal compassion sectors. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, the NHA's Director of Health Education.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
Before we get into all these beautiful things that you've done and where you've counseled and where you've worked, because you've interacted with a lot of people that I know for a very long time in my own life too. So we'll get into all of that. But your story is intriguing because you dealt as little as a dozen years ago with major morbid obesity, a plethora of addictions and chronic diseases. So take us through that journey of what were some of those aha moments and ways that you kind of transgressed through all of that, because it's really quite a story, actually.
Yeah, so actually in October of this year, well, September is when I checked in, but so September of this year, I will have 12 years of recovery from substance use disorder and also from major chronic diseases. And, if you were to kind of go back and get a sense of what was going on, how did you get there? It wouldn't be a singular event. It would be a series of drops in the bucket that kind of got me there. I grew up I was born in 1982 in Texas, and I grew up in an amazing household with amazing parents. And my dad taught me how to play every single sport under the sun. My mom inspired my imagination. As you mentioned, I have an identical twin brother who's actually been a guest on your show. I have a little sister, Jewel. And honestly, amazing. But for whatever reason, by the time I was about age 12, my dad stopped feeling like a safe, secure, and hopeful place to be in the presence of. He became a very hypercritical person. He became very concerned about mine and my brother's weight. We weren't really overweight. Like, I go back and look at photos of us and I don't get it. He became very critical of how we looked, what we decided to wear, and certainly what we decided to eat, to such a degree that it was confusing to us. Right. We didn't understand that these were the foods that they had decided to put into our home. So why, when we choose it, is it not okay? But when they choose it, it is okay. It also became very clear that they were noticing things about me that they didn't deem acceptable. And when you're 12 years old, your parents, your family, they're your whole world. So to feel unacceptable and unloved by your parents feels like the world doesn't care about you. And so I think what happened in that moment was I became very fearful, very hypervigilant. Well, if there's one thing about me that isn't acceptable, that is a problem, are there others? Why do I not know what they are? And I started to experience anxiety for the first time at a very young age. And it manifested in troublemaking behavior. And I was taken to a doctor and I was diagnosed with ADHD. And what the doctor said, and I want everyone to understand, this is not the exact words that the doctor used, but I was taken to this individual by my parents for the sole purpose of finding out what else is wrong with me. What else should they be concerned about? Should they want to correct? And this doctor essentially discovered, Adam, there actually is something about you that doesn't work right, that in fact is unacceptable, and that you should be very concerned about. And it's called ADHD, but don't worry, because we're going to solve this problem. We're going to medicate you. We're We're going to put you on this pill called Ritalin. And as long as you take this pill, it's going to hide and mask and insult the things about you that no one wants to see. Again, not the words the doctor used, but 12-year-old, man, that's exactly how I felt.
Right.
And we moved to Austin right before we started high school. And I experienced unbelievable bullying, physical, verbal. Every single day was a very, very scary experience. So I want everyone to understand, when I got up every single morning, I would find myself living in a body that I had been told by my parents and convinced by my parents was not a safe, secure, or hopeful place to be. I find myself in the presence of parents who are, without a doubt, they are the most incredible, loving, and caring parents, but sometimes they did not feel like a safe, secure, or hopeful place to be. I would go to school that felt physically, verbally, and emotionally like an unsafe, insecure, and hopeless place to be. And every single day felt like that. And the exact response that you should expect from any psychology experiencing that is anxiety and depression. Depression is a form of grief for your life not being as it should. It's a great way to think about it. And I want people to think of anxiety as an alarm bell that's letting you know that there's something going on, something in your immediate future that doesn't feel safe, might actually be a threat to your survival, but you can't figure it out. And so you're anxiously hypervigilant, trying to find out what it is and how can I solve it. And I remember being in class one day, and they had switched my medicine from Ritalin to Adderall at the time. And I took my medication in the middle of class. As I walked out of the class, the guys who were bullying me consistently surrounded me. And they essentially said, "Hey, Adam, just want you to know the bullying's over. You're new here. You didn't know anybody. You have to understand it's just hazing." This was the mid to late 90s. The advocacy around bullying wasn't the same. And in fact, we want to make it up to you. So we want to invite you to this party. Just bring your Adderall with you. Now, look, I may have been awkward. I may have been shy. I may have been very insecure, quote unquote nerd, but I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly what was taking place. And what was interesting was that I felt relieved, because what I think I had discovered at the time was I felt that I may have figured out how to feel a little bit more safe in a life that didn't feel like a safe place to be. I felt like maybe this is my ticket to not getting beat up every single day. So I go to this party, I bring it with me, and that's actually the first time I used Adderall as a recreational drug. I'm going to tell you, the minute that high dose took effect, I was completely hooked. But it's important to recognize I wasn't hooked to the substance. I was hooked to what it was able to deliver with ease and repeatability. That's important. I was shy and insecure, and Adderall is amphetamine. That's what the stuff is. I'm not saying that to be anti-medicine, just to be accurate. And so all of a sudden I have this flood of confidence, flood of energy. Because I'm supplying it to everyone there, all of a sudden, these people who were the day before beating me up are now acting as if they are my friends. I know they're not. I know it's not real friendship, but man, it looks enough like it. And that's all I was craving was friendship. And I was able to get that with ease and repeatability. I was able to make friends. I was slightly overweight in high school. And as I mentioned, Adderall is an amphetamine. And as I continued to use it over the course of a few weeks, I noticed weight loss occurring easily with ease and repeatability. My relationship with my dad started to change. I was no longer complaining about going to school. I was no longer complaining about the bullies or this or that. And I was also losing weight. All of a sudden, my father sees his son starting to enjoy his life. And so he starts to relate to me differently. So my dad's relationship with me changed with ease and repeatability. So what's really important to understand is that when we think about addiction, we need to think about not why it's a problem, but why it makes sense. If you or me and your life looked and felt like mine did, and you were to use like I did, what you would notice is that use looks and feels almost exactly like self-care. It looks almost exactly like the thing you were missing to make life exactly as you hoped it would be.
The classic statement in addiction field is that you're just self-medicating reward deficiency.
Yeah.
It's really the way they look at it. And in a way, you were a classic case. And in a way, it was like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They could say, now, see, Adam took that drug and look at him. He's a really functional, productive human being. That had to be the answer to the problem.
Exactly.
And then over bypassing all the years of shame and abuse that went on, that drove you into that particular position in space and time.
That's so it, you know, because not only was I seeing beneficial results in myself and how I showed up and how I moved through the world, but I was getting applauded for it.
Absolutely.
My dad was applauding me. I was making friends. That's worthy of applause, right? I was getting good grades. That's worthy of applause. I got a scholarship. That's worthy of applause, right? My esteem is rising as a result of taking this consistently. And so, you know, I bonded with it. That's what I like to tell people. I formed a meaningful bond with the behavior of using because of what using seemed to deliver with ease and repeatability. And it worked until it didn't. You know, I'm no different than anybody else who starts down the path of substance abuse. And at some point, your substance use becomes substance abuse. And at some point, that abuse becomes a disorder. And for me, that happened in college when all of a sudden the use was all I could think about. I no longer seemed to care about the meaningful bonds in life that would give me the sense of feeling meaningfully alive. My relationship to myself, my friends, meaningful work, my family, those bonds seemed to sever, as all I could obsess about was how much do I have left, how long will it last, where will I get more, how much will it cost, where am I going to get the money to pay for it? So I dropped out of college. I became a criminal drug addict. I was buying and selling on the streets. I would steal from people. I would do whatever I needed to do to get, you know, drugs or money. I treated my family like absolute garbage. The only time I would ever see them is to blame them and shame them for everything that was wrong in my life. By the time I was 30 years old, I had developed a secondary addiction to fast food. I was over 350 pounds, or about 350 pounds. I was 2 weeks away from being homeless. I lived like a hoarder. I had been cut off by family and friends, and living hurt. Living hurt in every single sense of the word. It hurt physically. It hurt emotionally. It hurt spiritually. Every single day that I was alive was the most difficult day of my life. And I lived it.
That's when you're in the throes of dependency, as you well know, because at that point, you're not using to get high. You're just using to quiet the pain of getting up in the morning.
That's exactly right.
How was your relationship with Bobby through all that? Your twin brother, was that all estranged too at that time?
It wasn't estranged. It was just difficult. And it was difficult because of me. I treated him very poorly. I stole from him. I did everything I could to kind of take advantage of the irreplaceable and unique bond that we have as twins in order to get things from him. And, I know that he was aware of how bad things were. And, we were talking every single day. And it's actually one of the things that, I regret the most about everything is Bobby and I have been our, closest humans to each other since birth. I like to use the joke that we were womb mates before we were roommates. And, on August 31st of 2012, life was at the lowest it had ever been for me. I'd been up for 5 days on amphetamines and opiates. I was looking at being evicted from my apartment. My dad and I were fighting all the time. And, I didn't have a plan. I had been battling like the idea of not being alive for probably 6 months. I'd been practicing self-harm in various ways, but I had never written any kind of note or had any plan of ending my life. And on August 21st of 2012, I suffered an overdose that was pretty darn close to intentional. Like I mentioned, I was up for days at a time, and I can remember just starting to take a pill, and then I just kept taking another one and another one and another one. And I had overdoses before, so I wasn't, the experience of an overdose wasn't something that was uniquely new to me, but this felt uniquely different. I can remember it starting to take effect. I was sitting on my couch, and I get this very lightheaded feeling. It's kind of like you're going to be sick feeling. And I tried to stand up to kind of shake it off. And as I tried to stand up, it felt like I got stabbed in the right side with a hot knife. My entire right side of my body just cramped up, like all the muscles seized. And I kind of fell forward. And as I did, I can see my vision going black very, very quickly. And, that was the feeling that I had in that moment. And I don't mean the physical description that I just laid out. I mean the feeling that I had in that moment. Now, Frank, I don't know what it feels like to die, but I do know what it feels like to believe that you're dying with a life full of regret. And I will tell you, that is definitely worth your fear. I remember thinking to myself, as those last shred of light that I could see kind of went fully black, I just remember thinking, duh, just give me one more second. Now, I survived. I ended up waking up on the floor of my apartment in a puddle of vomit and a pile of fast food garbage and empty pill bottles. And I was just overwhelmed with relief. I mean, every single cell in my body was just screaming it. And I found that odd because, I thought for a second there, what I wanted was to not be alive anymore. But that relief that I was experiencing could only be possible if there was something about myself and my life that I loved enough. Something about myself and my life that was meaningful enough that even though that day was going to be, without a doubt, the most difficult day I've ever had, I was relieved to still be here. And that's when I decided, I don't know how to do this for myself yet, but I picked up the phone and I called my family and I asked for help. And without question or judgment, they helped me check into treatment. And I remember within 3 days of being in treatment, because I've been avoiding doctors for years at that point, within 3 days of checking in treatment, I got diagnosed with advanced type 2 diabetes. I had an A1C of 12. Wow. My cholesterol was over 300. My blood pressure day one at rehab was 210 over 105. My resting heart rate was 112. And I got diagnosed with high cholesterol, high blood pressure, diabetes, anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, suicidal depression, sleep disorder, attention deficit disorder. They put me on a cabinet's worth of medication for life. And I remember sitting there across the table from the doctor. And he's saying all these things like, here's the reality, Adam, you have diabetes and heart disease. There's nothing you can do about it. These are genetic conditions. You're going to have them for life. We're going to medicate you for it, but yours are very advanced. So there's a very high likelihood that in the near future, you could have a cardiac event. So you need to take this very seriously. You could lose your sight. You could lose your hearing. You could lose a limb. You have, depression and anxiety and all these other conditions that they're genetic. There's nothing you can do about it. We're going to medicate you for it. But if you want your life to get better, you have to stop using drugs. And I remember thinking to myself, that might be the worst advice I've ever heard in my life. I mean, this guy just painted a picture of a future that I have no interest in being a part of. In fact, it was far more terrifying than what I thought was ahead of me. If anything, if that is certainty, I should double down on my use. Like I should be getting up every single day and trying to detach from being present in life. And in that moment, I was transported back to this event that my dad had dragged me to. 2010, my dad, who's one of the original founding investors of Whole Foods Market, dragged me to this event with a guy named Rip Esselstyn. Rip had just partnered with Whole Foods and they were offering these 7-day immersion programs. I didn't want to go. I didn't know what a plant-based diet was. I didn't want to know what one was. I didn't know who Rip was. I didn't want to know who he was. But I went because I thought if I did, I could get my dad to keep giving me money. And I went to this thing and I listened to every single lecture. I listened to luminary thought leaders and doctors like yourself talk about how you could use food and nutrition and lifestyle to recapture the experience of feeling alive. That's what I remember. I remember thinking, my goodness, that is a vastly different story than what this doctor at rehab was telling me. The people that I was listening to at Rip's retreat were saying that the reason why I'm finding myself in that chair, diagnosed with all those metabolic conditions in front of that doctor, wasn't because there's anything wrong with me whatsoever. In fact, it's the appropriate response to every decision I had been making for the past 10 years. It is exactly the way your biology and psychology should be responding to those choices. And if I was simply willing to change what I put on my plate, I have an opportunity to take charge of my life. So I decided I was going to build my recovery on a backbone of plant-based nutrition. It wasn't the easiest thing to convince people to do, certainly not in rehab. I moved into a sober living facility after 37 days of rehab. And that's where I was able to actually implement a whole food plant-based lifestyle. Funny enough, the manager of the sober living facility, the way it works is you go up to the manager and you write out a list of things that you need for the week. I was there with like 12 other guys. We're all living in the same house, trying to get sober and do all of our recovery things. And he would send a driver out once a week to get everything that you need, and for everyone else as well, and stock the house with it. And so I was like, okay, here we go. I'm just going to write him a list of the plant-based foods that I like. Now, At the time, the only greens I ate were the occasional piece of lettuce they didn't take off my burger at McDonald's. So the list was very short. But I walked up to the house manager, whose last name is actually Hamburger, and asked him if he would get these things for me. So my plant-based journey started with a hamburger, which is just, I mean, it's
That's
just
funny.
fantastic.
That's funny.
And I really put it in the system. I leaned into the work of Doug Lisle, his evolutionary psychology for understanding behavior change. Within 5 months, completely reversed my diabetes, my heart disease. I also had erectile dysfunction that I completely reversed. Within 10 months, I lost nearly 150 pounds. Within 1 year, I was off of every single medication I was put on in rehab, including all the antidepressants and mood stabilizers and sleeping medications and anxiety medications, everything. I remember checking into treatment. I was the most disconnected from life that I'd ever been. Everything about life was something I didn't want to be a part of. When I left recovery 10 months later, I was the most excited to get up and be present for life that I've been in my entire life. And I just kept thinking, my goodness, that nutrition must be playing some kind of role. Because I went through this sober living experience with like 10 other guys.
You think?
Right? None of them ever took their nutrition seriously, and they all stayed on their medications. A lot of them went on more medications or higher dosages of the medications they were on. A lot of them gained weight. Sure, they were sober, but their life wasn't any that much easier as a result of still having these struggles. I said, there's got to be a study. There's got to be some research that demonstrates the value of nutrition for mental health recovery and addiction recovery. And I came to find out that there wasn't a single study. Not a single.
Adam, hold that thought, because I want to take one short break for the NHA, and because I want to get deeply into that study with you. I want to talk about that. Great. So we're going to take a short break and hear from our sponsor, the National Health Association. I'm here with Adam Sud, and we'll be right back. You're listening to the NHA Health Science Podcast. Dr. Frank Sabatino here. Are you ready for an extraordinary adventure that combines relaxation, exploration, and vibrant health? Then set your sails for the NHA plant-exclusive cruises. Imagine cruising through exotic destinations, savoring delectable plant-based cuisine, and engaging in rejuvenating activities, all while surrounded by like-minded individuals passionate about health and wellness. These cruises offer more than just a vacation. They offer an opportunity to immerse yourself in the NHA's principles of healthy living. And they rank incredibly high on the ratings of eco-friendly cruise lines. We all know how important our oceans are, and our cruise partner, Windstar, is fully committed to this. Join us aboard our upcoming plant-exclusive cruises and experience the synergy of health and leisure. Delight in gourmet, SOS-free meals prepared by talented chefs. Attend informative workshops and enjoy the serenity of the sea, all tailored to nourish your body, mind, and spirit. For more details and to reserve your spot on our next adventure, visit healthscience.org and click the link under Travel. Don't miss this chance to indulge in a wellness retreat like no other. Elevate your well-being and make memories that will last a lifetime. And remember, your feedback matters. Please take a moment to leave a rating and a review wherever you're listening to the NHA Health Science Podcast. I'm Dr. Frank Sabatino, your host. Now, back to the show. Welcome back to the Health Science Podcast. I'm here with Adam Sud from Plant-Based for Positive Change, and we're talking really about the process of plant-based nutrition in dealing with mental health and addiction, truthfully. And this is an interesting story because, I want to get into this pilot study that you did because I think it's so profound. And what's interesting is that from the 70s, going back to the 70s and 80s, I wound up being in centers that they were not addiction treatment centers, but I was treating coke, heroin, dilaudid addiction with both fasting and plant-based nutrition going as far back as the 70s. And anecdotally, the results were really positive, but no one ever really wanted to take that any further. So with that as a preamble, I want to get a handle on this incredible pilot study you did showing plant-based nutrition's impact on the addiction recovery process. Let's talk about that. And you talk about early addiction intervention. So for people, discuss the difference between early and late intervention and how this whole thing came to pass, because I think it'll be enlightening for people.
Yeah, so the study was born out of the fact that I couldn't find a single shred of evidence to support my experience, and that made me angry. And so I decided to go back, really get certified in nutrition, find a way to work in clinics, and really, you know, kind of understand what was going on, and then find a way to recruit the best people to do the study. I was able to do that starting in, I think, 2017 or 2018 is when we actually launched the study. What we wanted to do was we wanted to investigate the effects of a specific dietary pattern on the early addiction recovery period. So early addiction recovery is defined by starting within the first 24 to 48 hours after an individual checks into treatment up to 1 year, right? That's early addiction recovery. The interesting thing that we discovered when really designing the study model was that there's no singular definition for recovery. There's no unified definition that says this is what recovery is, which means it's hard to figure out how you measure that. So we had to kind of define it for ourselves. And what we came up with, what we decided to really investigate was if you were going to really kind of find a way to measure successful interventions for recovery, you'd want to figure out what are the measurable outcomes that can predict success within that first year of recovery. And what we came to find out was that there are 2 or 3 very specific outcomes that you can use to kind of gauge whether someone's going to do really well or not. Now, obviously, this is not for everyone, it's just for the majority of cases. And those outcomes are resilience and self-esteem. That resilience and self-esteem, when you have an individual whose resilience and self-esteem seem to track higher, that they have a far greater likelihood of making it through 1 year than the individuals who don't. And so we said, great. Let's use those as our primary outcomes. We're going to run this study on a population of individuals who are in a treatment facility. So we found a treatment facility in Austin, Texas called Infinite Recovery. That's why the study is called the Infinite Study. Okay. And we would recruit them from their intake. So after they leave the detox stage of recovery, they are recruited into the trial. They are given the opportunity to decide to be a part of it. Obviously, they were compensated. What we did was, for every week that they completed within the study, we would grant them a $50 gift card to Whole Foods Market. We didn't want to give cash for obvious reasons within recovery. That's not a very safe thing to do, but we wanted to support them moving forward with their dietary changes. So we thought incentivizing them with gift cards that would end up being about $500 worth of gift cards for Whole Foods Market at the end was the right way to incentivize people. It was a self-selecting study. So it's a controlled trial, but it wasn't a randomized controlled trial.
This was inpatient or outpatient? Was it in residence or outpatient?
So the first 3 weeks occur inpatient, okay, and the remaining 7 weeks were in the sober living outpatient setting. Okay. We decided to allow for self-selection for a very specific reason. One, life is not a randomized controlled trial. People self-select into everything that they do for the most part. The second was really more important in terms of my personal feelings about recovery, which is what we know when we look at the data is that individuals in recovery who are given the power of choice tend to do better. And I did not want to hinder anyone's recovery. So they were able to self-select into either the control group, which was doing everything that the treatment center already does, including their already decided upon dietary pattern, which actually was a pretty healthy dietary pattern. It included meat, eggs, and dairy and some processed foods, but it did include a lot of whole fruits and vegetables. I was really impressed with the dietary pattern there. The treatment group was everything that the treatment facility already does, plus a whole food plant-based diet. Then we added nutrition education to match both of those groups. So if you were in the control group, you were given standard ADA nutrition education courses. If you were in the treatment group, the whole food plant-based group, we had a curriculum designed from a lot of amazing individuals to help educate and give self-efficacy to the benefits of a plant-based diet. And so
one step, the control group was getting the typical dietary pattern that the treatment facility would normally provide. Is that what it was?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. And we ran every single measurable outcome you can imagine. Full lipid panel, vitamin panel, omega-3 panel. We did all the depression and anxiety, so the PHQ-9 scale, the generalized anxiety disorder scale is called the GAD-7. We measured resilience from a scale called the Connor-Davidson Resilience Scale,
Right.
We did a self-esteem scale. I can't remember the name of the self-esteem scale. And we also did a self-compassion scale as well. So we were really interested in looking at the effects of how you view yourself, dietary changes. Now, what we noticed at the end of this study, and the study took about a year to collect all of the necessary participants and then another year to calculate all the data. What we noticed was that by about week 7 to week 10, within the plant-based group, there was a statistically significant increase in self-esteem and resilience compared to the other group. The other interesting thing to note is that there wasn't a single measurable outcome where the plant-based group did poorly. In fact, both groups showed benefit across the board, which says two things. One, Infinite Recovery does a really good job at helping people recover because every single outcome for both groups went up. But what's important is that the only group that showed outcomes better than the other group was the plant-based group. So self-esteem, resilience, and self-compassion were statistically significant, or had increases that were statistically significant compared to the other group. Now, everyone wants to speculate as to why. Why do you think we saw that? Now, there's a few things to note. When you look at the end of the study and you compare the two groups, when you look at the highest performing groups compared to the lowest performing groups, you see an almost 5x difference in fiber intake, which is interesting. What you also noticed is that when you look at individuals as they track past week 3 into the sober living, where they actually do their own cooking, you saw greater adherence to higher dietary quality in the treatment group versus the control group. What I mean to say is that the control group, after they left, they kind of went back to their old patterns of eating. They kind of went back to adding more processed foods, more junk food back into their life. The plant-based group tended to keep their dietary quality much higher, which means that there was something about the diet that felt important to them. It felt like it was important for them to carry it forward. When we think about why we saw that, I like to, we could speculate a whole bunch of things. We could say, oh, the gut microbiome. We could say all these, which are variables and they absolutely matter. People like to throw out the statistic. Did you know that 50% of your dopamine and 90% of your serotonin is produced in your gut? It's a great clickbait piece of content, but none of those neurotransmitters cross the blood-brain barrier. So they
don't cross. You also have to factor in the fact that treatment group had that education too. You can't rule that out because the educational component is a very powerful motivating tool that they had also, which is cool. Yeah.
The reason why we did that is because we looked at data, and what it demonstrated was that treatment facilities that include nutrition education have better outcomes.
No question.
Whether they're doing a healthy diet or not, they have better outcomes. So we decided to have a study where we were comparing 2 dietary patterns plus nutrition education against each other. Now, here's why I think you see the increase in resilience and self-esteem. I want you to imagine checking into treatment on day 1. I want you to imagine what it feels like to get to that point of end-stage substance use disorder. End-stage substance use disorder is a point where it has gotten so bad that if there's no intervention, tomorrow is far less promised than the most people around you. Everything about your life is a difficult experience. It doesn't feel like a safe, secure, or hopeful place to be. Your future feels unsafe and dangerous and terrifying. You're disconnected from a lot of the loving and meaningful bonds that give you the sense that there's a place for you in this world, and everything feels hard. On top of that, most people who struggle with substance use disorder engage in other behaviors that increase disease risk. So typically it's co-occurring with a lot of other metabolic disorders. So you're checking the treatment, you get thrown a whole bunch of psychological diagnoses, thrown a whole bunch of metabolic diagnoses, chronic disease diagnoses. All of a sudden you look down the trajectory of your life and a year from now feels awful to you. You can't imagine how you're going to get yourself out of this thing. You can't imagine what value you could offer the world. Everything feels like it's just gone even worse. Now I want you to imagine you take that person, you put them into a safe facility, and you organize their calories around a plant-based diet, and you have them live there long enough. And then you educate them on the benefits of it. What they're going to start to notice over those next 2-3 weeks is they're going to start to get some incredible feedback. They're going to start to see those disease processes reversing. Maybe they lose weight. Maybe they gain healthy weight. Some people are overfed and undernourished. Some people are underfed when they check into treatment. they start to notice that this thing of what they put on their plate and why seems to have an unbelievable effect at shifting the trajectory of their perceived future. When they checked in on day one and they looked down the road, they saw their diseases being worse. Imagine you're 35 years old and you're diagnosed with cholesterol of over 300 and diabetes. You have no understanding of those diseases. And you think about what's it going to be like in 5 years. You would have to have some kind of imagination to be able to figure that out. What you're likely going to do is, I don't know, it's probably going to be really bad. I'm probably going to be on more medications. Maybe I could have a heart attack. I'm really afraid of even thinking about that. After living in that plant-based environment for 3 weeks, those disease processes start to reverse, start to look down the road of your life, down the trajectory of your life, and you go, hang on a second. I'm kind of curious, what's this going to be like in 4 more weeks?
Right.
What's this going to feel like in 5 weeks? What's it going to feel like in 6 months? My goodness, that's an exciting prospect to think about. I'm actually starting to feel quite motivated to find out what that day is going to look like. And because of that motivation and because of the sense of what it's going to be, I'm resilient in my efforts to do so.
Right.
I'm resilient to, like I tell people all the time, resilience isn't just mental toughness in the face of adversity. It's about having a sense that there's a place beyond today that you're excited to be a part of, a future that feels safe, secure, and hopeful, that when the moment that you're in feels hard, and it will sometimes, you're not only able to fight, you're willing to fight because you want to see the reality of that future place come to life. You want to protect all the efforts that you're engaged in right now in order to get there. That's why I think we saw resilience in the plant-based group increase. Why I think we saw self-esteem is, I think, likely due to that plus the nutrition education.
Can I address something with you?
Yeah.
Because this is important. When you look at, you made a very important point that typically in addiction recovery parameters are very nebulous. You made that point. But one of the things that's typically used are retention rates. And this is kind of an important piece. So when someone usually enters a rehab program, within a very short time, there's about a 97% dropout. The retention rate is less than 5%.
Yeah.
So, and because you start feeling bad and you know that you can feel better by just using, so you use again. So what I want to understand is that in your control group and in your treatment groups, what did the retention rates look like? I'm surprised that your control group, you were able to keep people in the program, because typically retention rates is so poor and relapse is so profound. So how did you overcome that very typical obstacle that's usually seen in addiction recovery work?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, our study started in January of 2020. So we ran right into COVID. So there was a lot of other reasons why retention was difficult.
Yeah.
We saw probably, about 50% retention rates of people, but there's various reasons. A lot of times insurance just stops covering a participant because they're no longer considered that they're an immediate threat to their life, right? That they're not going to, die tomorrow. And so insurance stops covering them. So that's a reason why some people would opt out and leave treatment, is they can't afford it anymore. Right. Other reasons are, all the other reasons you mentioned. So I think that Infinite Recovery has a really good retention rate, slightly better than industry standards. And I think what we saw was just their typical retention rate play out amongst the group. Where we saw follow-up, we saw higher retention in the plant-based group compared to the control group in the follow-up data that we captured at month 6 in year 1, where we saw more people in the plant-based group still doing it, which is interesting. Also really important to note that within the standard recovery model, not only is there a poor retention rate within their treatment programs, but there's also about an 80% recidivism rate for individuals. And I think this is important because what that means for individuals who are listening is that 80% of people who check into treatment today will check back into treatment within 1 year. However, that number is artificially lowered because it doesn't account for the people who die within 1 year.
Right.
So if the number is closer to 85, maybe even 90%. And so we know that the system that we're using.
Now, both of those groups got similar psychological intervention, and all the other support systems, right?
Everything else was controlled.
The only variable was the nutritional variable, basically.
Yep, the nutrition and the nutrition education.
And we saw significant changes in relapse prevention too, obviously in both groups, as you just said, because there was such a recidivism rate. So that's profound in itself, because the standard is not that in the industry, as you well know.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note that one of the other things that we found was this is the first time resilience has ever been linked to diet, period. So we now know that plant-based diets have some kind of mechanism that increases resilience, which is now measured. The other thing that's great to note is that there's always been a sense that extreme diets are dangerous in recovery, that people can hide their eating disorders behind them. They can do whatever, and that you're missing out on key nutrients that are important for recovery. They always talk about fish for brain health. But what is really important to recognize is that there wasn't a single variable, biometric, metabolic outcome, or psychological outcome where the plant-based group didn't do as good or better. So what that means is if you're an individual who is thinking about checking into treatment and would like to pursue a plant-based diet, at very least, the plant-based diet is as good as any dietary pattern in recovery. And it also might likely be the best dietary pattern to choose.
And because it's not about deprivation, it's about eating well, not less. That's really the most important piece of this.
Exactly.
Because you're eating huge volumes of high fiber, low calorie dense food. So there's no lack of satisfaction. That's the problem. A lot of these fad extreme diets are fostering that sense of deprivation. That's the last thing you want to do with an addicted population. It's
and you mentioned
not going to work.
You touched on this point earlier about the experience of dopamine. Everyone talks about dopamine as this thing that you don't want to do anything that raises your dopamine. Well, here's the thing. You obviously know this, but dopamine acts as a guidance system. It acts as a guidance system, trying to help you figure out what's the right move to make in order to survive. And it does really well within a very specific environment. That environment should look like one that is representative of our natural history and our natural behavior, right? So somewhat scarce, competitive, and dangerous. Our psychology does really well there. As you start to mess with the environment, as you start to shift that environment away, and you start to introduce these stimuli that trigger dopamine responses that go way outside the bounds of what is appropriate for our psychology. This is important for people to hear. There's a range of experiencing pleasure that is appropriate to your psychology, meaning that when you engage with something, the pleasure response from that decision should fall within a range for you that is good enough that you'll want to do it again when you need it, but not so great that you'll risk your life consistently to get more. And remember that drug use is the ultimate experience of a dopamine surge for little time and little energy.
Right.
You are habituating yourself to requiring massive amounts of dopamine in order to feel like you're doing well. You take away those drugs, you put someone into a dopamine deprived environment, and then you allow them to stimulate that artificial dopamine response with hyperpalatable foods that are doing the same dopamine response. It's going outside the bounds of what is appropriate. It doesn't have the same intense effect as, say, heroin or cocaine, but it still operates in the same fashion. You are not allowing your dopamine receptors to regain their sensitivity and recalibrate to what is appropriate to your psychology. And that's a big part of recovery, is kind of like a dopamine reset, allowing you to get back to that sense of understanding what real pleasure feels like, how you get it, what I call cheap dopamine actually feels like. Scrolling on your Instagram or going and eating junk food that's just to drinking an energy drink just to feel a buzz. It's cheap dopamine. It's not the real thing. It's not how we actually should get it by employing a little bit of effort and a little bit of will to achieve something valuable for ourselves. And so I think that if we are looking at recovery honestly, we actually need to remove those hyperpalatable foods. We need to remove those junk foods from the environment. We need to allow people to recalibrate themselves to an environment that looks enough like what is appropriate to our psychology, or else they're always going to be chasing something that feels very similar to the behavior of drug use.
Well, it's interesting because going back into the 60s and 70s, when the food conglomerates hired people like Howard Moskowitz, they tried to find just that right amount of salt, oil, and sugar
Yeah.
that if you add to food, you could create what was called the Bliss Point back then.
Right.
They didn't really know about brain reward cascade, but they knew about Bliss Point. And so what happens is once they discovered that amount of stuff that they could be adding to ultra processed foods to really addict people to keep buying these products that were reinforcing this process of addiction, the only way to change that is to eliminate those addictive substances. So when we recommend eating all, salt, oil, and sugar-free, there's really a reason for that, and it plays a major role in recovery. It's a very strong piece of recovery.
You're absolutely right. I talk about this. I've said this a few times in lectures where I say, think about this. If salt is actually by itself so addicting, why do we not see people walking around just eating table salt? And if sugar is so by itself singularly addictive, why wouldn't someone who has a sugar addiction just go buy a bag of sugar and eat it walking around? If fat by itself is so singularly addictive, why are people not just walking around buying a cheap bottle of oil and drinking it? You don't see that. And the reason for that is because what we are witnessing when we talk about food addiction isn't an addiction to salt, fat, and sugar. What you're witnessing is the appropriate psychological response to the combination of all three of those in doses that were never supposed to exist. That's really, really important. That is the appropriate psychological response to a stimulus that we were never supposed to come into contact with. I like how Doug Lisle explains it from the analogy of going out at night and looking and seeing your porch light. If you leave your porch light on at night and you go outside, likely what you're going to see is moths, and they're attracted to the light. And the reason why they're attracted to the light is because they are designed by nature to use the brightest lights in the sky for navigation, celestial objects for navigation. It's how they know what's the right move to make in order to do well in life. But when the brightest light in the sky is no longer the stars, when it's now your porch light, their guidance system, their survival instincts get fooled. They hit that light, they flutter down, they hit it again, and eventually they're going to die. And you would stand there and you'd watch them and you go, that's interesting. There must have been something psychologically wrong with that moth. Why would it do that repeatedly until it dies? And then why would any of the other moths who just witnessed that follow suit and do the same exact thing? There must be something wrong with them. But if you were to pause and consider from a subjective point of view, what's actually taking place, those moths are thinking and feeling like they're doing the exact right thing when in fact they're self-destructive. By messing with the environment, by introducing a supernormal stimulus, a stimulus that was never supposed to be there, that was never supposed to exist, that animal now runs the threat of making very poor decisions, potentially even fatal ones, all the while thinking and feeling like this is the right thing to do. That is very much what is taking place when we look at the modern food environment and when we look at the modern drug environment. What you are witnessing isn't a failure of people's psychology and biology. What you're witnessing is the appropriate response to environments gone terribly wrong. This is not a failure of humanity that we can't stop eating these foods. Our psychology was never designed to defend itself against these things.
And where can people find you if they want to pursue, the work that you're doing and some of the insight that you have? What's the URL you want them to go to?
Yeah, you can go to adamsud.com. I've worked with amazing programs. My good friends at Mastering Diabetes, Robbie and Cyrus, I've been with them since they started the company. I no longer am coaching for them. I was a food addiction and insulin resistance coach for them. I lecture for Rip Esselstyn. In fact, tomorrow I'm going out to North Carolina to lecture at Plant Stock. It's going to be a lot of fun. And then I do a lot of conferences in the addiction recovery and mental health space. So if you're interested in working with me as a coach, having me as a coach, you can find that out on my website. If you're interested in having me come and speak at an event, you can also find that out on my website as well.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So yeah, and I urge people to do that and pursue that. One of the models that came out of addiction work in the 90s was that they discovered that there was a genetic mishap on one of the what are called the alleles of the dopamine 2D receptor.
Yeah. And
they discovered that people that had that deficit, which accounts for about 30% plus of people with addiction, was that when they first, that was kind of like a dormant situation. And the first time they used substance use, when they got in any substance use disorder, that was typically that was the best they ever felt.
Yeah.
And so what happened was when you took somebody that drank alcohol and now that was operating and they had this feeling of well-being, and you're saying, you just need to stop drinking. And they're kind of like, yeah, I don't think so. That's really the best that I've ever felt. So what they discovered was that there was a cocktail of basic amino acids that needed to be magnified in the case of those situations. Have you found that of any use in the work that you've done? It's a cocktail of 4 amino acids, which I won't go into because it needs to be controlled properly. But we know that that affects and helps people that have that underlying genetic mishap to be capable of relapse prevention more successfully. So have you had an opportunity in your work to work with any of that kind of supplementation?
I haven't personally, but there is a real truth to what you're saying. So you'll see that in people with ADHD and neuroatypical brains, where they have a fast metabolize, they're fast metabolizers of dopamine, where they have what we would call an interest-based nervous system, meaning that if they're engaged in something, they'll get this burst of dopamine and it causes them to be interested and focused. But that dopamine gets metabolized really quickly, and all of a sudden their interest in it is gone. And the jumping from task to task is actually looking for something novel to stimulate dopamine, that they kind of exist with a slightly lower level of circulating dopamine. And when you live there, any kind of substance that floods you with dopamine is unbelievably attractive to you. It gives you a sense of feeling like, oh, this is how it's supposed to be, because I know what it feels like when I don't use. I know what it feels like for me normally. I have a low sense of being able to get interested in things and get self-starting and all of the things that you see sometimes in ADHD and neuroatypical brains. And so the dopamine factor is very, very real. I haven't worked with any data on that cocktail, but I've heard stuff like that, and it seems really interesting.
I have used that cocktail over many, many years, and in those particular instances, it does have value, and it plays a major role in relapse prevention. And it also plays a major role of people being more compliant with staying on the dietary changes and the lifestyle choices and following through on all the psychological intervention and support that they need. So all of that is helpful, and it kind of dovetails with all of that. So in down the road, what's exciting to Adam? What are you looking to, what do you want to do down the road? Anything on the horizon for you that you're excited about?
That's really, I appreciate it. There's a lot of great things. My favorite thing in the world is being married to my wife. And so I wake up every single day, and I get to live my wildest dreams, just knowing that I'm married to her. I always tell people, like, people always like to put up a before and after of me, me at 350 pounds, me at 175 pounds. And they go, wow, look at that profound change. I get why they think that's profound change, but before and after photos are just clickbait. Profound change is spending half of your life believing that you're not valuable at all to the world. You're unlovable, you're unlikable, you're a burden. To waking up and knowing that there is a collection of humans that are excited to hear from you, to be surrounded by a community of shared respect. I have those, and I have the most incredible friends, really, really great friends, Robbie and Cyrus, Rip Esselstyn. I'm going to miss people, so I don't want to say everybody, but
no, it's all cool. I get it.
What I mean is, if I was to pick up the phone and call them, any one of those people, they'd answer the phone. The reason why they would do it is because they want me to be a part of the goings-on of their life, because my presence in their life enhances the quality of theirs, and I want them to be that for me. Profound change is waking up one day, standing in the presence of the most incredible woman you've ever met in your life, spending half of your life believing that no one would ever find you valuable, and listening to this unbelievable woman say, I love you so much that I want to partner my life with you. That's profound change. And for anybody out there who's struggling, who's listening, I'm going to tell you right now, I cannot believe that I tried to end my life right before the best part of it ever began. If you are struggling, if you are having a tough time, however you want to define it, and you are considering, something that could be a final decision, if that's you, what I want you to understand is, number one, I see you 100%. I know exactly who you are. I know how you feel. And let me just tell you, There are far more solutions that exist in going just one more day than there are in ending it right now. I've lost 6 friends to suicide and overdose since getting into treatment. It's unfortunate. Long-term recovery has consequences. Right. Not everybody makes it out with you. One of my friends who I lost, unfortunately, he didn't die from overdose or relapse. He died from complications to surgery. He was an amazing guy named David Clark. David Clark was a 300-pound alcoholic turned vegan ultra runner, unbelievable guy. He had the best quote I've ever heard in my life. And one of the things that I like to do when I do talks or podcasts is I really like to honor David by sharing this quote with everybody, because what you believe about yourself has consequences. I'm speaking to the 6 friends of mine who are no longer here who did die by drug overdose and suicide. It has consequences on the people you love. I miss those people every single day. And I want to miss them every day. They deserve it. But I think that there's a misconception on how to become happy. You'll hear things like, if you want to be happy, you should live like it's the last day of your life. I remember David Clark would say that's a terrible quote. It's awful advice. If you went out and lived like it's the last day of your life, you would probably not do any of the things that are important to taking care of yourself. Certainly wouldn't want to go to your job. You wouldn't want to cook healthy food. You wouldn't want to clean your house. All the things that are important, giving you a sense that your life is going well. You wouldn't do those things. He said, if you would really like to be happy, instead of living like it's the last day of your life, treat everyone you meet as if they're living the last day of theirs. And I just take that with me everywhere I go. And, if you're someone who's struggling, you don't need to have answers. You don't need to know what to say. But if you love someone who's struggling, you don't need to have answers and you don't need to know what to say. I just want you to call that person that you love who's struggling and say, I love you. I love you whether you're using or you're not. I love you whatever state you're in. And if you need me, I don't know what to do, but I'm going to help you figure out what's the first move to make. If you do that, I'm telling you, that person who hears that is going to be reminded that they matter. They're going to be reminded that they are a part of the important goings-on of someone's life, that they're not just a collection of disorders and problems and struggles and a burden for someone, that they are important. And when you remind them that they matter, that gives them permission to say, I don't know what I'm doing. And that's the start.
Adam, I can't thank you enough. I can't thank my guest, Adam Sud, enough for this time. Your message, your life, your inspirational story was just mind-boggling and so heartfelt and so touching. And just the message of love and compassion that you radiate and manifest, it's fantastic. I urge people to follow Adam. If you're looking for some coach with this kind of compassion and insight, you can see his URL scrolling across the show notes. I urge you to follow him. And I want to thank everybody that joined us today, because without you, we can't do what we do. And I wanted to really thank you for being part of this very active, healthy community. And on behalf of the National Health Association, I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and I look forward to being with you on the next episode of the Health Science Podcast. Adam, thank you so much, really.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association. Thank you for joining us today and for your commitment to evidence-based health science that backs a whole food, plant-exclusive lifestyle and contributes to the well-being of all people, animals, and our environment. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Be sure to leave a rating and a review, and we'll see you on the next show.